This episode continues our series about the Revolutionary Union, the industrial workers of the world, which we introduced in episode 6. So if you're new to the IWW, I would go back and listen to that one first. While many people have heard about the IWW, perhaps the most important working class organisation in American history, an essential part of the union story has often gone under the radar, and that is the role of women in shaping the union. Women were at its founding conference, were leading workplace organisers and soapbox speakers, took militant industrial action and got thrown in jail. This is working class history.
There are women of many descriptions in this queer world, as everyone knows. Some are living in beautiful mansions and are wearing the finest of clothes. There are blue-blooded queens and princesses with their charms made of diamond and pearl, but the only and thoroughbred lady is a rebel girl. It's a rebel girl.
Today we're very happy to be joined by Heather Mayer, author of Beyond the Rebel Girl, Women and the IWW in the Pacific Northwest, and contributor to Wobblies of the World, a global history of the IWW. Both of these texts reveal a lot of information about the under-researched role of women in the Union. We'll start off with one story which illustrates just that. Heather, thanks for joining us. In your chapter in Wobblies of the World, you tell the story of Edith Frenette and the Everett massacre. The Everett massacre is quite a well-known incident in IWW history, but you tell it from a really different perspective, which is really interesting. Could you maybe say a bit more about that?
Yeah, that was really the inspiration of my entire focusing on this area of research, is because I was familiar with the story of Everett. The well-known version is, Everett, the city north of Seattle and Washington. There had been kind of some disputes in the lumber mills in the area. There was a lot of kind of tensions there, and the IWW members were coming in and speaking on the street and trying to organize, and increasingly being met with violence by local kind of vigilantes, usually business leadership in the town. And so, this kind of keeps building and building and building until they announce that there's going to be this massive, free speech rally. And a boatload of 250 Wobblies are coming in from Seattle to the town of Everett, and they're met by these vigilantes and, sheriff deputized citizens. And, this is kind of the famous anecdote where they try to stop the Wobblies and say, who is your leader? And they say, we're all leaders. And then somebody fires a gun, a shootout ensues, Wobblies end up dead, sheriff ends up dead. And so, this is kind of the traditional picture of this story. And then when I started to look into it more, I would see, this woman's name keep popping up, Edith Frenette. I saw that there were all female pallbearers at the funerals of the men who died during the shooting. I saw that there were pictures of women and all of these things. So I started to be more interested in the story of what role the women were playing. And I did find that Edith Frenette was actually one of the main organizers of these free speech fights that were happening. She would be arranging for a boat to take people into town. And during the trial that ensued after the massacre, she was really pointed to by even, the mayor of Everett, saying, she's the mastermind, she's the one behind all of this. And when you look at the newspapers in Everett and how they were talking about the IWW and these strikes, they were saying, it's all of these women and children and girls are showing up to listen to these, Wobblies speak. And, they really shouldn't be doing that. And so, women in the community were very well involved in the lead up to the massacre and the free speech fight that was going on.
We're going to return to Edith Frenette and Everett later on, but it is just one part of a much larger story of women in the Union, which began with its founding conference in 1905.
Well, at the founding convention in 1905, there were about 12 women out of the roughly 200 participants. The most well-known would be Mother Jones, who was a well-known activist among especially mine workers, and Lucy Parsons, the widow of the Haymarket martyr Albert Parsons. And so those were the two kind of really well-known women. There was a lot of women from Chicago, since that's where the founding happened, a lot of people who were involved in activism in that area.
And as the union grew sort of over time, what sort of women joined the union?
It really kind of depends on the location. As we know, the IWW organized in many different regions in many different industries. And so in the East Coast, you have women who were textile workers, garment workers, those types of things. In the Northwest, you have some cannery workers, tailors, domestic workers were organized in some areas, most notably Denver, Colorado, waitresses. So all different types of occupations could be organized by the IWW. It doesn't mean there was a large presence, but women kind of from all walks of life.
And what about women who would have the profession of housewife?
So that was brought up early on in the union, and there was kind of this question of, can they join? Are they technically workers? And basically they said, yes, women can join a mixed local, meaning a local that was not organized by industry, but many different types of workers. But they never really kind of addressed it any further. So I think there were women who would be considered housewives who did join the union, but it wasn't kind of there wasn't a, housewives industrial union.
And so what was the kind of political perspective of the union on the role of women in society, the emancipation of women, and that sort of thing?
Most Wobblies left it fairly vague. There was this idea that there needed to be more women in the union, and that, once one big union kind of ideal had come about, then things would be better for women. But it wasn't really articulated. I would say that intersectionality was not a strong point for the Wobblies at this time. I mean, they really focused on class identity first and foremost, in that women workers should be identifying with male workers more than they should identify with women of the upper class. So there was, I think, an appeal there because it left it kind of up to women for how they wanted to see their place in the union and the type of women's issues they wanted to focus on. So there was a freedom there, but it was fairly vague as far as what women's emancipation would look like.
In your book, I think there's quite an illuminating exchange from the pages of Industrial Worker in the letters page between a kind of male worker and a woman worker about what they, about their views.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of my research, to see that exchange. And so the original letter was signed by a man toiler. And it basically said, had this idea of a family wage, that what men need to do is to organize and be able to make enough money so that their wives didn't have to work, which is a fairly kind of conservative union view at the time. And this woman wrote back, signed a woman toiler, and said, we want to marry you because we love you and we can't live without you, not because you can provide for us financially. So both men and women need to be making a living wage. And Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the kind of most famous female organizer in the union, also talked about this as well, and said, the point of, the one big union ideal for the IWW is not that women should be in the home or that they should be forced to work, that everybody should be making, a good enough wage that women can make those choices on their own.
That was a really really interesting exchange, which I think not only, goes into the question of wages, but also, love and relationships. Do you think you could maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah. Famous anarchist Emma Goldman kind of made that argument during this period of basically marriage is prostitution. A woman is exchanging, her life and her sexual availability for being economically provided for by a man. And so the Wobblies did somewhat share this point of view, in that they were advocates somewhat of free love during this period. And we don't think of it in the kind of, 1960s free love, everybody's, hooking up with everybody kind of thing. But really, it was a critique of marriage as a relationship with the state, or marriage as a religious institution. So the belief was more that people should have the freedom to, enter into and dissolve relationships as they so choose. And so, there is this kind of tie into the way that prostitution is talked about by the Wobblies versus kind of by larger society during this period. Because the argument in the late 1800s, early 1900s was that women became prostitutes because either they just liked sex so much, or they were mentally unstable in some way, or something drew them to that life. And the Wobblies made the argument that prostitution was an economic issue, that women were driven to prostitution as a means of supporting themselves. And they made that, very clear to tie that this is part of the larger problems of capitalism. It's not a moral failing on the part of a woman. It is an economic issue. They were not puritanical in that way of making kind of moral judgments of women's sexual behaviors within the Union, although that was very much used against them by the authorities and by the media.
An example you cite where I believe cannery workers, took strike action for a pay increase, saying that the low wages they were on were a cause of people turning to sex work, basically.
Yeah, they literally held signs on the picket line that said 40 cents a day makes prostitutes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they made that argument like very, like this is what we're talking about here. If you're not going to pay us, then that's what's going to happen.
The earliest example of a campaign that you talk about in the book, where women took a leading role, was the Spokane free speech fight in 1909. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, and this is one of those interesting cases where it's a fairly well-known story in the history of the IWW, this first free speech fight. And it's very much often seen as part of this, rough and tumble, single male hobo, element of the IWW that was involved in this free speech fight, where basically the city of Spokane tried to stop the IWW organizers from speaking on the street and getting to workers in that way. And so they kind of put out this call. So, everybody, all the Footloose Wobblies, come to town and, speak on the street. We'll continue to be arrested. We'll basically test how the city can enforce this law. So what was interesting, in addition to, the hundreds of men that were arrested, there were several women who were there that were arrested too. And when women were arrested during events like free speech fights, they were often released very quickly. So the men would be held for, sometimes up to 30 days, in these terrible conditions. But the women tended to only be in jail for a day or two, and they were back out on the streets. So they could really help advertise what was going on in the jails, advertise what was going on, during this whole kind of process, and were able to really spread that message. And one of the interesting things that ended up happening in Spokane is they started writing about the conditions in the women's jails. And this ends up getting, some of the more progressive upper class women in Spokane kind of involved in this issue. And they end up actually making a change in the system in Spokane and appointing the first kind of female matron in the city jail as a result of this publicity from the women in the IWW. So it wasn't necessarily, that wasn't a goal of the free speech fight. It was very kind of a tangential aspect of it, but it kind of pointed to the important role that women's participation played within these movements.
That was something that was really interesting because, yeah, as you say, that free speech fight and the free speech fights in general are written about quite a lot. But most accounts don't really talk about, apart from occasional, the mention of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, or other kind of leading figures being in town, rarely mention the role that women played in them.
Yeah, and another interesting part of the Spokane fight actually happened when a bunch of young boys were arrested for selling the IWW newspaper. And so one of these was the son of one of the major organizers of the free speech fight. And his wife and his son he was arrested, and his wife and his son were coming in to kind of watch the trial. And the judge starts to make these comments about how, no respectable woman would ever set foot in an IWW hall, and any woman who would allow their child to go there is, an unfit mother kind of thing. So just making all of these judgments about, the respectability of these women and these families who were involved with the union in Spokane. And so the next day, this judge's chambers is filled with women, making the argument that, we can make decisions about our children and about our respectability, and you don't get to make that call and say whether or not we're good parents for letting our children, be part of this movement. And he kind of very quickly backpedaled on his comments. But it was just another way in which, this element of families, about wives of organizers, being part of the IWW in the Northwest really has kind of long been ignored, with the focus on these single male workers.
Yeah, and so the Spokane free speech fight, like the other free speech fights, sort of ended in authorities essentially caving in to the demands of the IWW to allow them to speak on the street. So they were sort of important in helping the union organize in those areas. As well as that sort of thing, there were a number of industrial disputes of predominantly female parts of the IWW. Could you tell us about a couple of those, key disputes?
Yeah, the most well-known would be in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and Paterson, New Jersey, with silk workers and textile workers. And that's where, the workers were predominantly women. And the IWW had success in organizing workers of a lot of different nationalities, a lot of European immigrants in particular, because they would kind of come into these areas and really rely on local connections that were already there. I mean, the IWW did go in and try to organize specific industries, but also very often it came in when there was already a conflict. And so they were better able to kind of capitalize on the networks that were already built up and the frustrations that were already there, and help kind of provide some leadership, some structure, some voice to some of these women who were striking. And that's also what happened with the cannery workers in Oregon. It was really more of a walkout that was then approached by the local Socialist Party leadership and the local IWW leadership to basically say, how can we help you with this? And so they were able to kind of amplify these women's voices. So there were, women who were involved in smaller industries and smaller strikes too. Like in the Seattle, Washington area, there were women's working in tailor shops. And these would be really small shops, with maybe 10 to 20 workers. And so they're not kind of these big, massive, thousands of people on the street kind of strikes. But they are, still organizing women and still helping to kind of amplify their voices and fight for better conditions. So it really was in all different kinds of areas. And like I said, in domestic work in Denver is one of the examples of just kind of getting workers together to demand better pay, or to help people find a job, rather than having to rely on an employment agent who might, take a cut of their earnings. So there was a lot of different ways in which women were involved as workers with the union.
Now we'll return to the Everett Massacre, the story we heard at the start of the show.
The way that the newspapers talked about the Wobblies during this period, it's similar to how you would hear Fox News describe Antifa right now, basically, to say that, basically sounding like they are, these incoming hordes, they are going to attack everyone. The editorial the day of the massacre, when the Wobblies were coming in on this boat, said, these men are entitled to no sympathy. They deserve everything they get. So they were really seen as just this, this out of town, disreputable element that is coming to, upend life as we know it. But when you look at the actual trial, there were a lot of just regular female citizens of Everett who testified on behalf and said, I went to these speeches and they never incited violence, and I was always treated well. And it was the authorities that attacked them.
Yeah, just say, I think it's probably worth pointing out to sort of listeners that the trial was not of the deputies who shot the Wobblies, but it was the trial of the Wobblies who were shot.
Right. Yes. Sorry. They basically arrested like 75 Wobblies right off the bat for the death of one person on the kind of deputy's side, and then they put one man on trial, Thomas Tracy, to kind of begin the trial for the death of this one man. And another interesting aspect of this trial is that women in the state of Washington had already been granted the right to vote, and so there were actually women on the jury, which is different than a lot of these cases. Usually when the IWW ends up in court, it's very much, what they would refer to as a kangaroo court. They'd already decided on their guilt before they even get started. But there were women on this jury, and a lot of this court case really had to do with this idea of, are these people outside agitators, or are they members of our community, and do they represent the values of our community? And Tom Tracy ended up being acquitted, and they let go all of the other Wobblies who stood to be tried. And so it was actually a bit of a success for the IWW in this period. Gained a lot of publicity for their cause.
You mentioned that a lot of the witnesses were to what happened were local women as well, including more generally who would be seen as generally respectable types who owned property and really helped sway public sentiment.
Yeah, and that was, it was part of this kind of interesting, tightrope walk that the Wobblies did as far as how women were portrayed and how they kind of use this idea of respectable women or being part of the IWW, because they very much did say, look at all these women who were part of this movement, and you call them respectable, so how are you saying that we're outsiders? But they also thought very much that, women shouldn't be given later sentences than men, that women should be treated in the same way, but still kind of fell back on some of these gender stereotypes about respectability. For example, during this trial, one of the women who testified, her husband, you would say, it was one of the organizers as well. And you actually find out during their testimony that they only got legally married like the week before the trial started. And they're asking them about that. And it really is like they had been together in a common law relationship, it sounds like, but probably to help promote this idea that they were, respectable citizens, they decided to officially get married before this trial, so she could, legally be seen as his wife. How
did authorities react? I mean, in episode 6, we talk a bit about how, authorities reacted to male Wobblies with a lot of lynchings and killings and jailings and that sort of thing. How did authorities react to women members of the union?
So, women, for the most part, were not subjected to quite the same level of violence that men were. And authorities often, tried different ways of getting at women. And one of the examples that I found really interesting was a case of 2 Wobbly organizers in Seattle who ended up being tried basically for white slavery laws during the time period. So white slavery was the idea, it was really a myth that white women were being, kidnapped and drugged and sold into prostitution. That was the idea. And it was a really big panic around, 1913, 1914. But it did get laws put into place, known as Mann Act laws, that basically said you couldn't take a woman across a state line for immoral purposes. And, immorality is a very vague term legally. It's pretty much whatever, the arresting person decides it is. And it didn't matter if, for example, you could prove there was sex outside of marriage. Even if the intent was immoral, you could still be arrested for this. So as these male and female organizers in Seattle were organizing during this Taylor strike, they were arrested and they charged basically the man with bringing the woman over from Russia for purposes of prostitution. And this wasn't the case, and they were able to prove this wasn't the case. But all of the, the testimony, everything that they're looking at about these 2 Wobbly organizers was about, are they immoral people? And the immigration authorities are talking a lot about, being members of the free love cult. And one of the things, their pieces of evidence against this woman was that she had nude pictures taken of herself when she was, I think, in her late teens or early 20s. And so they tried to use that as, she's an immoral woman in that way. And, she basically just responded like, I wanted to remember how I looked when, when I'm older. I want to be able to, capture myself in my prime. Um, but they try these all kinds of ways to try to use all of these laws around immigration or around immorality or around, prohibition later on. That was often used as a way to search people's homes, to say that, maybe they were making liquor in their homes. So they tried to get at these people in all kinds of ways having to do with basically moral judgments on their lifestyles.
In addition to labour organising activities and, work around legal defence and trials and free speech, what sort of other activities did women wobblies get involved in?
Women wobblies, were a large part of the cultural aspect of the union as well. When you look at the IWW newspapers, there are advertisements for, parades and picnics and, movies. There's an IWW band, with female members, all different kinds of things that were happening at these union halls. Spokane was a particularly good example of a union hall that had a lot of these kind of family activities. And so women were a part of that culture of the IWW as well, in kind of in opposition to what we normally think of as that, the hobo jungle wobblies, singing songs kind of thing, that, there was also these, women singing IWW songs in the IWW band. And women were also involved in other actions that really spoke much more concretely to women's lives. And one of those in particular was birth control agitation. So during this time period in the early 20th century, it was illegal to send information about birth control by mail. And so Margaret Sanger, who becomes very well known as the founder of Planned Parenthood, really was associated with the IWW in her early years and very explicitly tied the need for birth control to working class emancipation. And so, these arguments that were being made by women in the IWW is that, women need to be able to choose how many people should be in their families, to be able to care for the people in their families. And that, keeping women away from that information is, a tool of the master class to basically keep the working class, impoverished, and to keep, fodder for the armies and that sort of thing. And so women helped to spread information about birth control. In a lot of, speeches around the country, and IWW speeches, talked about actual, information about how to prevent pregnancy, to the best of kind of medical knowledge at that time. And one of the members of one of the big supporters of the IWW, Marie Equi, who was a physician in Portland, Oregon, helped to kind of edit some of Margaret Sanger's information for medical accuracy to help spread that information about birth control. So, that was a very clear case of where women wobblies were doing things to help women's lives that wasn't necessarily tied to organizing in the workplace, but tied to their life experience. Unfortunately, I think the height of this kind of radical birth control agitation really coincided with the United States entry into World War I. And so a lot of women who were involved in that kind of turned to anti-war activism in those early years, and the birth control movement became a little more tied to physicians and to kind of more middle-class ideas about morality and that kind of thing. And so it's unfortunate to see how, where that activism would have gone were it not for the U.S. entry into the war.
And I think this is something that your book covers really well, is like the class element in the birth control movement, which, I wasn't even really aware of before, because I think a lot of what, when that is spoken about, often it's just kind of implied that at the time it was either kind of Victorian kind of moral attitudes or Christian attitudes or whatever that saw that as a problem. But the Wobblies at the time were making the point, as you say, that it really benefited employers and the wealthy for working class families to have loads of children, yet, like you say, to fill the army and to create a reserve army of unemployed laborers, essentially, who would work for the lowest wages.
Yeah, and part of that access to birth control information, we see that middle class and upper class families, were having fewer children during this period. So it's not like the information wasn't there. It just wasn't getting to working people. And during this period, what was kind of really seen as the most reliable form of birth control was, to use a diaphragm, which needed to be fitted by a physician. So again, middle and upper class women who had access to physicians who would give them this information, who would do that for them, were able to have smaller families. But it was working class women who didn't have access to the information, who were desperate. I mean, they were desperately seeking ways to have fewer children, some in ways that could be dangerous to their bodies, because they didn't have access to that type of information, because it benefited employers, and for moralistic reasons, on behalf of the authorities, that information shouldn't get out. The pamphlet that Margaret Sanger put out on family limitation, it actually became subject to this campaign in Portland, Oregon, where the people who were distributing it were arrested. And the judge kind of had to make these arguments about why that pamphlet shouldn't be available. And he said, well, I'm not against people learning, about birth control, but this pamphlet talks about enjoying sex, and that was part of the thing that, it wasn't just about having fewer children. It was also about, that sex should be something that was not, scary for people, that people should have information about. And so that was part of this kind of moral panic around the Wobblies, that they would kind of undo family life and morals as we know it, because of kind of frank attitudes about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, completely. And I suppose, Dr. Equi, who you refer to, was openly lesbian at the time as well, which must have to, authorities have been, quite a radical thing.
Yeah. And, from all the recollections, that I've seen, and the way, that she was treated by the Wobblies, it was not an issue for the working class people that Marie Equi worked with. And that's kind of part of the general, to each their own kind of philosophy of the Wobblies, of, attitudes towards sexuality. But, Marie Equi, and the reason I kind of mentioned earlier that she wasn't officially a member, because she was a physician and self-employed in that way. So she couldn't necessarily be a member as a member of the working class. But she was, an avid supporter of the union. And she did things, like providing abortions for working women, or providing access to birth control and birth control information, and that kind of stuff really, it was tremendously beneficial for the working people that knew her. And she was tremendously supported, particularly when she was arrested for speaking out against World War I. She had a lot of support within the working class community in Oregon, because of, the way she was able to help women in that way.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us on to, another movement that women Wobblies were heavily involved in, which was opposition to World War One.
Yeah, the IWW itself did not take like an official stance against the war, but many members of the union were anti-war. And I talk in particular about the cases of two women, of Marie Equi that I just mentioned, and another woman, Louise Olivero, who was a member of the union in Seattle, who sent a bunch of flyers out urging people basically to resist the draft. And so, there was a draft during this period, and Woodrow Wilson, the president, basically said, it's not really a draft of the unwilling, the entire nation is willing, and we're just selecting people, to which she thought, was ridiculous, said we wouldn't need a draft at all if we had enough willing people who wanted to fight in this war. And so, some women in their anti-war activism urged people to either resist the draft, to register as a conscientious objector, which was an option during that time period, but it wasn't easy. Even if you were a conscientious objector, you still were kind of under the control of the military. And so women were involved in that way in anti-war activism during the World War I period, and were subject to a lot of persecution because of it. It was basically illegal to say anything bad about the military or the flag or the government while the country was at war. In Marie Equie's case, what she was accused of was basically referring to the military as scum during a speech, which she always contested she never did, and many of the Wobblies contested that she never did either. There were, of course, spies at any of these events who were spying on these activists, trying to get anything that could be used against them.
With Mary Equi, that specific bit of the allegation was, almost certainly nonsense, because the whole point of the radical opposition to the draft in World War One was that it was your own brothers and sons and being sent off to die, not scum.
Right. That it's working people from the United States fighting against working people in Germany. That it's an employer's war that the working class people have no part in or no stake in.
And I guess unfortunately both of those individuals, Louise Olivero and Mary Equi, ended up getting put in prison for their opposition to the war.
They did, and that's one of the things during this time period that really, struck me so much in doing this research is, the tensions of persecution on a movement and on a community. There's a ton of infighting going on during this period because everyone was under so much stress. When you could be arrested for simply visiting the IWW hall, where that used to be the center of where you go to see your friends and you take your children. And now, you're subject to being just rounded up and arrested if you even go near it. And there's all these questions about, where do the resources of the Union go? Who should be supported and who shouldn't? It was a tremendous amount of stress on this entire community that really was detrimental to the Wobblies in this whole war experience. I mean, we know that the leadership was taken out across the country, and put on trial in Chicago. But even in these smaller cases, women were arrested for, going to visit male Wobblies who were in jail. A woman, stepped up for her husband to edit the industrial worker newspaper, and she was arrested. It was, even if they didn't end up with long jail sentences, it really just disrupted the entire community and added so much stress to people's lives and stress about who, what kind of action should be supported. For example, the letters that Louise Olivero sent out urging people to resist the draft, she did on her own. That was she paid for it on her own. That was her own action. But she was the stenographer for the Seattle local, and she was a member of the union. And so the union gets kind of pulled in to, what she had done as an individual. And some people were upset about that, so there was all kinds of some infighting issues that were happening because of this tremendous amount of stress everyone was under. One of
the most tragic examples of that is it comes up in our episode 9 about a later period in the Wobblies when IWW leader Big Bill Hayward skipped out on his bail and went to Russia. But from reading your book, I found out it was a woman who'd put up her house for bail, and ended up losing her house when he didn't. When I guess the Soviet Union didn't pay back the bail money, and then she ended up committing suicide. A really difficult time.
All of these kinds of, decisions that were being made at upper level leadership, really kind of trickled down and played an important role in a lot of people's lives. And I write about in kind of the conclusion about the case of one male Wobbly, E.F. Dory, who was arrested, and is a series of letters between him and his wife. And he really just he basically quits the union during this period while he's arrested. And there was this infighting about, whether or not people should accept clemency or, pardons, or whether they should wait until, everybody is pardoned, and all of this stuff. And he didn't like the way his wife was being treated by the executive board on the outside, and all of these things, again, just kind of bubbling up because all of these decisions that people had to make as everybody was being arrested and sentenced to many years in jail.
at this time period that we're talking about, there's also a more mainstream feminist movement and a movement for women's suffrage. Um, how did women in the IWW relate to that? Relate to that movement, and I guess to middle and upper class women in general.
It's almost amazing, how little the idea of suffrage is brought up, among IWW activists during this period. I mean, basically, when they do talk about it, they just kind of say, the vote hasn't helped working class men's emancipation. Why would it be any different for women? And so they obviously weren't against, women having the right to vote, but it definitely wasn't where you should put your energy, basically, towards getting women the right to vote. And in some of the Western states, women had received the right to vote a few earlier than they did at a national level. So it wasn't as big of an issue again, in Oregon and Washington by the mid to late teens. But they really talked about this idea of upper class and middle class women having nothing in common with working class women. They often made fun of upper class women in the newspapers, and talked about experiences like, in Spokane, where the upper class women would, do one thing in support of women in jail, and then kind of turn their backs on the whole movement. And they just kind of repeatedly pointed out, that even if you think that these, progressive upper or middle class women are on your side, they still benefit from this system that keeps workers in bondage, so they are not really your allies, basically. And so, suffrage was, it was the main way that the main avenue for upper and middle class women's activism during this period. It was kind of the focal point. And so that, I think, was one of the appeals of the IWW to women, is that it provided another avenue and focus of activism that wasn't so politically driven.
You also mentioned the progressives, who I guess were a reasonably prominent group at the time, kind of liberal, reformist, progressive type people. And from their perspective, they thought they were advocating for women and women's rights. So how did the approach of the IWW say differ from that kind of from the middle class progressives?
It was really a case, of progressive activists deciding what was best for people, not necessarily listening to what the people themselves wanted. And we see that case in the packing company strike in Oregon in 1913, that basically there's kind of this progressive, reform group that basically takes on negotiating an end to this strike without taking the demands of the workers into account, without involving the workers in these negotiations. And, the workers were pretty mad about that at the end, like, oh, the strike is over. And they're like, what? We didn't have anything to do with the settlement. So it really was, I mean, and I'm not saying that the progressives were bad people by any means, but it was very much an idea of what, is proper, what is deserving. There's a lot of jokes in Wobbly Papers too about, the deserving poor, the people who deserve to get helped and handouts and all of that kind of thing. It was really about kind of making judgments on what people's lifestyles should be, and not really listening to their own wants or needs. And so I think, again, that was an avenue where the Wobblies really helped to, helped people to advocate for themselves rather than advocating for them, without listening to their needs.
The IWW in general was, particularly important for its opposition to racism, especially at the time, and its kind of pioneering organizing of all workers together, white, black, migrant, and native, and a lot of its leading activists were men of color. Was this the same case for women of color? I mean, certainly it's apart from say Lucy Parsons, there aren't many well-known women of color who are part of the union who a lot is written about, to my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is one of those cases also of inclusive rhetoric, but not necessarily inclusive, organizing or action. The IWW certainly said that everyone should be organized, and that all, working people should be organized together. But how often, did they really listen to the needs, and wants of workers of color? I think, is an area that they spoke about more than they actively tried to do. As far as women workers go, I've found, very little evidence, especially I researched the Pacific Northwest, so the majority of the IWW women that I saw were either, born in the United States or Canada or European immigrants. There was one woman in the Portland strike that was referred to in newspapers as an Indian woman, but I couldn't find more information on her. So I think that, they really did not do as great of a job of organizing in that community. And it could partially be because the type of activism and the culture of the IWW was, not as inclusive as it's kind of as they make it out to be, in words. And even, Lucy Parsons herself, she was of mixed race ancestry, and the daughter of a former slave, but she portrayed herself as being of mixed, Native American and Mexican ancestry, and she never really spoke out about specifically like racial issues. Again, it was about class at the forefront. And so, even though there was, a woman of color, she was not particularly speaking out, about race as an issue. And again, women of color in the workforce at this time period, a lot of times in domestic labor or agricultural work in regions of the United States where the IWW did not have as much of a stronghold. So I think, there were possibilities there, but I don't think that the union was really that effective.
What lessons do you think that, we can learn today from the experiences of women in the IWW, basically 100 years ago?
I think, one of the biggest lessons of looking at the IWW during this period is that there are many routes to activism. That there doesn't necessarily have to be the person who's getting arrested in the free speech fight and, traveling around organizing for the union and out there, kind of on the lines. Like, that's an important part of it. But there also needs to be room for, people who can just, maybe give a donation to the strike fund or go make a meal for somebody in jail or to participate in, a union activity. That there are many kind of routes to activism, and that's part of building a community. And that's part of, these arguments that are made, I think, are very similar today in looking at activists through a lens of respectability. In the same way that they did 100 years ago, they still look at, people who are active on the streets in a protest and, look at these people and, they're not respectable people type of things. And so, I think those arguments are still being made. And I think it's interesting to look at how the Wobblies kind of combated that by really making sure that they did identify the interests of the community around them, to say that, we are here fighting for the same things. Even though, I may not look like you or I may have just came to town or whatever, we do have similar interests. And so I think, there are a lot of lessons there, in just, the community aspect of activism, as well as just, the creative multiple ways that Wobblies went about, trying to create the world that they wanted to see. It wasn't just, women in the IWW wasn't just about organizing them in the workplace. It was about, the interests, in all facets of their life. And so I think that that's really important for activism today as well.
We've had girls before, but we need some more in the industrial workers of the world.
That's all for today. We've got links in the show notes to get Heather's book and Wobblies of the World, as well as lots more information and further reading. In addition to episode 6, our episode 9 is about the little known later part of the IWW's history, so give that a listen if you haven't already. Coming soon, we've got an episode on the history of the IWW in Australia, so do subscribe to make sure you catch that. You can get first listen of that episode and all of our others by supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Thanks also to the Salt Lake Tribune and their Joe Hill Legacy project for the music used in today's episode. Links to them in the show notes as well. We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our patrons for their generous support and for making this podcast and the Working Class History Project possible. So really thank you, it means a lot. This episode was edited by Daniel Waldorf. Catch you next time.
Rebel boy. We've had girls before, but we need some more in the industrial workers of the world. For it's great to fight for freedom with the